Amelia Reed was running like a mad woman through the pitch-dark streets of Manhattan on a November night, so cold it cut straight through skin and bone. Her heart was hammering so violently it felt as though it might burst out of her chest, and her ragged breaths rose in thin white clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared in the frozen air. Behind her, Harlan's yelling still echoed between the tall buildings like a voice thrown up from hell. Her stepfather was chasing her in a drunken, raging frenzy, the same way he did every time he lost every last dollar at the casino and decided to pour all that madness onto her. The same way he did on every night he drank too much cheap whiskey and turned into the demon she had endured for long years. Ever since the day her mother closed her eyes for the last time, her lip had been split open, and blood still seeped out, salty and sharp on her tongue each time she swallowed. A bruise was already blooming on her left cheek where his fist had landed, and the ribs on her right side burned with every breath, as if someone were driving a knife into her again and again. But she didn't have time to think about pain. She didn't have time to cry or to be afraid. She only knew how to run, how to hide, how to disappear into the New York night as if her life depended on it. Because it did. Her life truly depended on whether she could get away tonight. Without realizing it, she ran into the Upper East Side, where the mansions and penthouses of New York's elite rose like fortresses of wealth, where the cars parked along the curb were worth 100 times more than everything she had earned in her entire life, where someone like her, hair a tangled mess, face smeared with blood and tears, wearing a thin hoodie that couldn't begin to hold back the biting cold, did not belong. And when her tear-soaked green eyes caught sight of a glossy black Rolls-Royce Phantom sitting in a deserted alley, tucked away from the streetlights, its rear door slightly ajar, as if fate itself were holding it open, she didn't think any further. She didn't weigh consequences. She didn't worry about who owned the car. She thought of nothing at all except the desperate need to escape, to vanish, to be safe for even a few minutes. She slipped inside and curled up on the floor between the front seat and the back, folding in on herself like a child trying to hide from a nightmare, trembling uncontrollably and silently praying to whoever might be listening up there in the dark. Please don't let anyone find me. Please let me have peace for just one night without fearing the heavy footsteps and the alcohol-soaked breath of the man who had taken everything from her. What Amelia didn't know, what she could never have imagined in the desperation closing over her in that moment, was that the Rolls-Royce Phantom belonged to Rocco Bianchi, the boss of the most notorious Mafia family in New York, a man whose name alone was enough to make the entire underworld tremble, and that he would approach this car later, a concealed weapon ready in his hand, and that this accidental meeting between a desperate girl fleeing hell and a Mafia boss drowning in the icy loneliness of power would change both of their lives forever in ways neither of them could possibly foresee. If you're ready for this story, please hit like to support the channel. Don't forget to share the video with friends who love deeply moving stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories. Amelia Reed hadn't always lived in hell. There had been a time so long ago that now she could only reach for it in the rare dreams that weren't overrun by nightmares. When she had been loved and protected, when she had grown up inside the warm embrace of the gentlest woman in the world. Beatrice Reed, her mother, was a nurse who worked the night shift at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, a woman with glossy auburn hair, just like Amelia, and green eyes that always shone with tenderness whenever they rested on her daughter. She had raised Amelia alone from the moment the baby was born. After Amelia's biological father walked out the instant he learned Beatrice was pregnant, disappearing as if he had never existed in their lives at all. But Beatrice never held a grudge, never complained, never spoke bitterly. She simply worked harder, loved her daughter more, and turned their small Brooklyn apartment into a home filled with laughter and simple dinners overflowing with love. Amelia could still remember as clearly as if it were yesterday, those Sunday mornings when her mother didn't have to work, when the two of them would curl up together on the worn old sofa, eating pancakes with cheap maple syrup bought from a discount store, watching old Disney movies on their tiny television. She remembered the nights her mother came home after a long shift, so exhausted her eyes could barely stay open. Yet she would still stop by her daughter's room, kiss Amelia's forehead, and whisper that she loved her, that Amelia was the most wonderful thing that had ever come into her life. They weren't rich, not even close. And it might have been fair to call their life a struggle, especially when Beatrice picked up extra shifts to pay Amelia's school tuition. But they had each other. And to the Amelia of those years, that was enough. That was everything she needed in this world. But then everything began to change in the year Amelia turned young. When Beatrice met Harlan Collins at the hospital, Harlan was an accountant for a health insurance company. He'd come to the hospital to handle some paperwork and happened to run into Beatrice in the staff break room. He was older at the time, a man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, a gray suit that always looked perfectly pressed, and a gentle smile convincing enough to fool just about anyone. Harlan courted Beatrice with bouquets bought from the corner shop, with dinners at a small Italian restaurant near the hospital, with sweet words about a steadier future, about Beatrice no longer needing to work herself to the bone, about Amelia having a father she could lean on. And Beatrice, a woman worn down by carrying everything alone for years, believed him. She believed the warmth in Harlan's eyes whenever he looked at her. She believed the way he waited patiently for her after every long shift. She believed the promises of a better life he painted with words as smooth as velvet. They married in the spring of Amelia's year, a small ceremony at City Hall, with only a few of Beatrice's friends there as witnesses. Amelia remembered standing there in a floral dress bought from a thrift store, watching her mother beam beside Harlan, and how she tried to feel happy, tried to believe this was the beginning of something good, even though deep in her heart there had always been a small voice whispering that something was wrong, that something was hiding behind that perfect smile. And that voice had been right. Months after the wedding, when Harlan officially moved into the Brooklyn apartment with the two of them, everything began to change in ways so subtle that Beatrice didn't even notice. At first, Harlan started controlling the finances, saying he would manage the family's money because he was an accountant and understood these things better. He began offering suggestions about how Beatrice should dress, about which friends she spent time with, about how she ought to stop working nights because it was bad for her health. And then, one night, when Harlan drank too much at a company party, he took his anger out on Beatrice for the first time just because she forgot to buy the brand of beer he liked. Amelia could still hear the sound of that slap cracking through the small kitchen, could still see the stunned look on her mother's face, could still feel Harlan's eyes as he turned to Amelia, as if warning her not to say a single word. And that was only the beginning. Years after the wedding, when Amelia had just turned older and was struggling to finish her year at community college, with a dream of becoming a graphic designer, Beatrice began coughing up blood. At first, it was only faint streaks on a tissue that she hid so no one would know. Then it became the long fits of coughing in the middle of the night that stole her sleep. Then the relentless exhaustion that no amount of rest could wash away. Harlan didn't care. He only complained that Beatrice's coughing kept him up and ruined his workday, that she should take cough medicine instead of disturbing the whole house. But Amelia saw it. She saw her mother's skin growing paler by the week, saw her eyes sinking deeper into her face, saw her body thinning as if something were eating her from the inside out. She begged her mother to see a doctor. And when the test results came back, Amelia's world collapsed completely. Stage 4, lung cancer, already spread to her liver and bones with a life expectancy of no more than a year. The doctor delivered those words in a calm, professional voice, as if he hadn't just handed down a death sentence to the woman Amelia loved most in the world. Beatrice had never smoked a single day in her life, but years of working in a hospital, breathing in chemicals and dust and whatever else drifted through those corridors, had silently planted the disease inside her without anyone knowing. The next months were the longest and most painful months of Amelia's life. She watched her mother wither day by day. From a beautiful woman with glossy auburn hair into a pale shadow lying motionless in a hospital bed, her hair nearly gone from chemotherapy, her skin stretched tight over bone because she couldn't keep food down. Harlan never once came to the hospital to visit his wife. He said he hated the smell of hospitals, hated the sight of sick people. And Beatrice should understand that. He stayed home instead. He drank every night. He He still hit Amelia whenever she came back late from the hospital because she had dared to make him cook for himself. Amelia endured it all in silence. She didn't dare tell her mother, afraid it would worry her, afraid it would make her condition worse. Every day after class, she went to the hospital and sat by her mother's bed, holding that thin hand marked with bruises from IV needles, forcing herself to smile as if everything were fine, as if she weren't dying right alongside her mother. A little more each day. And then the last night came, the night Amelia would never forget, even if she lived 100 more years. Beatrice lay there, breathing faintly through an oxygen mask, her green eyes now clouded, yet still searching for her daughter's face in the dimness of the hospital room. She gripped Amelia's hand with all the strength she had left, and in a voice so weak Amelia had to lean close just to hear. She whispered words Amelia would carry for the rest of her life. She was sorry. Sorry for bringing Harlan into her daughter's life. Sorry for not being strong enough to protect her. Sorry for believing that man's lies. Sorry for having to leave her child alone in this world. Tears slid down Beatrice's hollow cheeks as she begged Amelia to run, to leave that house as soon as she could, to live the life she deserved. Amelia sobbed, sobbing as she had never sobbed before, and promised her mother she would be all right, she would be strong, she would find a way out. But she didn't know it was a promise she would not be able to keep for years. Beatrice Reed drew her final breath in the morning while outside the hospital window the season's first snow began to fall over the icy city of New York. And Amelia, older and utterly alone in the world, walked out of the hospital with a heart shattered into a million pieces and had to return to the home where Harlan Collins was waiting like a predator, waiting for the weakest prey to finally wander into the trap. Years after Beatrice's death were years in which Amelia no longer lived. She only existed like a walking, breathing corpse that had died from the inside, like a ghost trapped in a home that had become a prison, like an animal caged so long it no longer had the strength to growl or claw. Right after her mother's funeral, Harlan moved quickly to seize the entire life insurance payout, nearly $50,000 that should have belonged to Amelia. Money her mother had paid into for years of backbreaking work, hoping to leave her daughter a better future. Harlan told her in the tone of someone granting a favor that he would keep the money to take care of both of them. That Amelia was too young and too foolish to manage that much money, that she should be grateful she still had him to look after her instead of ending up on the streets, wandering like an orphan no one cared about. And Amelia, still drowning in grief, still dazed and uncertain about what to do with her life, accepted it in silence. It was the greatest mistake she ever made, and she would pay for that silence with years of hell. Harlan forced her to drop out of college, saying school was a pointless waste of money, and a girl like her didn't need a degree for anything. He found her a part-time job at a 24-hour convenience store near their apartment, the night shift. And every month, when Amelia got her paycheck, he would be waiting at the door to take every cent, leaving her nothing at all, not even enough to buy a cup of coffee or a pack of sanitary pads. Harlan controlled every part of Amelia's life with the meticulousness of a tyrant. He checked her phone every day, deleting every contact except his own number and the number of the store where she worked. He wouldn't let her have friends. He wouldn't let her go out except for work. He wouldn't let her speak to anyone, not neighbors, not co-workers, no one. She wasn't allowed to have her own bank account. She wasn't allowed to keep any identification because Harlan had hidden her passport, her birth certificate, her social security card in a place she could never find. She became invisible inside her own life, without an identity, without a voice, without the right to exist as a human being. And the beatings grew more brutal with time, as if Harlan needed to hit harder, hurt more, make it last longer each time to satisfy the bottomless thirst for violence inside him. He hit her with his hands, with a leather belt, with an electrical cord, with anything within reach whenever he was drunk or lost money gambling or simply felt irritated after a bad day at work. He struck the places her clothes would cover, her back, her stomach, her thighs, so no one would see. So Amelia would have no proof to take to the police, so she would remain a silent victim. No one believed. Amelia tried to run twice during those years. Twice she gathered every shred of courage she had left, opened the front door, and ran out with the hope of freedom. The first time was when she was older. She fled to the nearest police precinct, shaking as she described what Harlan had done to her. But when the officers called Harlan, he arrived wearing the worried face of a good father, explaining that his late wife's stepdaughter had mental problems and often made things up. And the police believed him. They let him take Amelia home, and that night she was beaten so badly she couldn't stand for days. The second time was when she was older. This time she didn't go to the police. She ran to a shelter for abused women, hoping they would help her hide and start over. Harlan had shown up with a lawyer and forged court orders, declaring him as Amelia's legal conservator. He used his professional background to create a paper trail of fake mental breakdowns and hospitalizations, making it legally impossible for the shelter to intervene. After that, Amelia never tried to run again. She had lost all hope, all will, all reason to keep fighting. She woke each day, went to work, came home, endured the blows, and waited for death to come and free her from this hell, the way death had freed her mother years earlier. She didn't cry anymore because her tears had run dry long ago. She didn't dream anymore because dreams only brought more pain when she woke and realized she was still trapped in this endless nightmare. Amelia Reed, older, was no longer the girl with green eyes that once glittered with hope in the years she had with her mother. She had become an empty shell, a living ghost, a creature that knew only fear and endurance, and the expectation that the end could arrive at any moment. That fateful night arrived on a Saturday in November when the early winter cold had begun to creep into every corner of New York City, and Amelia had just come home from a long shift at the convenience store, her legs aching and her eyes nearly unable to stay open from lack of sleep. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw the lights still on in the morning. Because normally Harlan slept until noon on weekends and never woke up this early. Her heart tightened as she pushed the door open and saw him sitting there on the worn old sofa in the middle of the living room, a whiskey bottle almost empty in his hand, his eyes bloodshot from the drink and from something even more terrifying than drunkenness. A wild fury boiling under skin gone a bruised purplish red. Harlan had lost everything that night, lost every cent of his monthly pay at an underground casino in Chinatown, lost even the money he had borrowed from loan sharks in the hope of winning it back. And now he owed those men nearly $20,000, money he had no idea how he would repay, money that could get his skull smashed in if he didn't come up with it within a week. And as always, as every time over the past years, Harlan needed somewhere to pour his rage, needed someone to blame, needed a victim to torment until he could feel that he still had power, that he still controlled something in his miserable life. He rose, staggering toward Amelia with the eyes of a rabid animal, and began screaming that it was all her fault, that she was a cursed daughter who had brought bad luck to him from the day she was born, that if it weren't for her, Beatrice would never have died, that Amelia was a useless burden who did nothing but feed off him and ruin his life. The first punch landed on Amelia's face before she could even react, so hard she fell backward to the floor and saw bright stars bursting behind her eyes. But Harlan didn't stop. He kept kicking her ribs, her stomach, her back as she tried to curl into herself to protect what she could, his mouth pouring out venomous insults like snake poison, burning through whatever pieces of her soul were still left. Usually Harlan was meticulous, striking only where her clothes would cover the evidence. But tonight, fueled by the loss of his last dollar and the pressure of the debt collectors, his mask of control had shattered completely. He no longer cared about hiding the marks. He only wanted to destroy her. He wanted to turn her into a punching bag for the madness blazing inside him. And then in that moment, as Amelia lay on the kitchen floor with blood on her lips, with ribs hurting so badly she could barely breathe, with her ears ringing from a blow to the head, she saw it. A fruit knife lay on the kitchen counter less than a yard from her hand, its metal glinting under the light like an invitation, like a question waiting for her answer. Run or die, kill or be killed. Those were the only two choices left tonight. And in that instant, something inside Amelia shattered. Not her will, not her soul, but the fear that had imprisoned her for years. She didn't reach for the knife. She knew that if she picked it up, she would use it, and her life would end in a prison cell instead of in this house. Instead, when Harlan turned his back to grab more liquor, she snatched the nearest table lamp, a heavy ceramic lamp her mother had bought from a thrift store years ago, and hurled it at Harlan with every last ounce of strength left in her battered body. The lamp shattered when it struck his shoulder, not his head the way she'd aimed, but hard enough to make him stumble and howl in pain and shock. And in that brief sliver of time, Amelia ran. She bolted out of the kitchen, sprinted through the living room, yanked the front door open, and fled outside into the bitter dark of New York, running as if hell itself were yawning open right behind her, running as if her life depended on every step, because it did. Her life truly depended on whether she could escape tonight. At the very same time, Amelia Reed was running madly through the pitch-dark streets of Manhattan to escape hell. Elsewhere in the city, in a VIP room on the top floor of an exclusive club known only to the richest and most powerful, Rocco Bianchi was bringing the most tense meeting of the year to an end with Mafia bosses from other families. Rocco was older, tall, with a solid, powerful build forged through years of training and fighting. His black hair as dark as night, combed back to reveal a high forehead and thick brows that seemed permanently drawn together, as if he were always thinking about something deeper than ordinary people could understand. But the most unforgettable feature on his face was his eyes, gray and cold as a winter sky before a storm, sharp as a blade waiting for its moment. Eyes that could see straight through a man's insides and make even the most stubborn criminals lower their gaze, unable to meet his stare. He was the head of the Bianchi family, the most powerful mafia empire in New York. With decades of dominance over the underworld, controlling everything from casinos to smuggling, from real estate to the kind of dark contracts no one dared speak of in daylight. His father, Vincent Bianchi, had built that empire from nothing with blood and tears and the bodies of anyone who tried to stand in his way. And when Vincent died of a sudden heart attack years ago, Rocco inherited it all. The glory and the burden, the power and the loneliness, the invisible crown and the shackles that could never be removed. Tonight's meeting had lasted hours, covering the division of new territory after a small Brooklyn family collapsed. The shipping deals moving goods through the port, who would control which streets, and how much each side would pay for the privilege of doing business on someone else's ground. Rocco had sat there for hours with a face as unreadable as stone, listening to offers and threats from the other bosses, making decisions that could change the fate of hundreds with a single nod or shake of his head. And not for 1 second did he let the exhaustion gnawing at him show. But now, when the meeting was over and he stepped out of the club into the bitter air of a November night, Rocco felt that weariness crash down like an unstoppable tidal wave. It wasn't physical fatigue because his body was still strong and alive with energy. It was the tiredness of the soul, a deep, hollow depletion. No sleep could heal, no glass of liquor could soothe, no woman could fill. Rocco Bianchi was one of the most powerful men in New York, able to have anything he wanted with a single phone call, able to make anyone disappear with a flick of his fingers, with hundreds of men willing to die for him and thousands more so afraid they didn't dare speak his name. But he was lonely, lonely down to the bone. Lonely in the way only those who stand at the summit of power can understand. He had no one he could trust completely, no one to share the weight pressing down on his shoulders, no one who looked at him as a human being instead of a terrifying boss or a walking wallet. His mother had died when he was young, and he still remembered with painful clarity the last night he saw her lying motionless at the foot of the stairs with blood flowing from her head and his father standing over her with eyes like ice, saying it was an accident, that she fell down the stairs, that Rocco wasn't allowed to cry because Bianchi men never cried. He had no siblings, no close relatives, no real friends except Gino Moretti, the loyal right-hand man who had been with him since his teenage years. Many women had passed through his life, dazzling beauties drawn to his money and power. But none of them stayed long enough to understand who he truly was, and none of them wanted to. Gino was already waiting beside the glossy black Rolls-Royce Phantom parked in a deserted alley a few steps from the club, ready to drive his boss back to the penthouse the way he did every night. But tonight, Rocco shook his head. He told Gino to go on ahead, that he wanted to drive himself, that he needed a little time alone to think, to breathe, to exist as an ordinary man instead of a mafia boss carrying the whole world on his shoulders. Gino hesitated for a second, because letting the boss go alone late at night was never a good idea in their world. But he knew better than to argue when Rocco had made up his mind, so he only nodded, handed Rocco the car keys, then stepped back into the darkness and disappeared like a silent shadow. Rocco walked toward the Rolls-Royce alone, and he had no idea that inside that car, fate was waiting for him in the form of a young woman with auburn hair, curled up and trembling on the floor, and that after tonight, his life would never be the same again. Rocco walked up to the Rolls-Royce Phantom with the slow, even stride of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. One hand in his pocket, his gaze fixed forward, yet every sense awake and razor alert, the instinct of a predator honed by years in the underworld. And it was that instinct that made him stop short a few steps from the car, his gray eyes narrowing to slits as he realized something wasn't right. The rear door was slightly open, just a small gap of a few centimeters that an ordinary person might have missed. But Rocco wasn't ordinary. He was a man who had survived dozens of assassination attempts and understood that in his world, a door left unlatched could be the difference between living and dying. His right hand slid inside his black cashmere coat and drew a loaded pistol, the motion fast and smooth, as if the weapon were a natural extension of his body, and he advanced toward the car with steps as quiet as a stalking cat. His finger already set on the trigger, ready to squeeze within a fraction of a second if he had to. He yanked the door wide open, the gun aimed straight inside, and what he saw made him freeze for a rare moment in which Rocco Bianchi was truly caught off guard. It wasn't an assassin sent to kill him, not an enemy lying in wait, not anything he had prepared himself to face. Instead, he saw a girl, a young woman with auburn hair in a wild, tangled mess like a bird's nest, and wide green eyes staring in terror at the barrel of his gun, huddled on the floor between the front and back seats, like a small animal cornered and waiting for death to fall at any moment. For several endless seconds, no one spoke, no one moved, the tension in the air so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Rocco studied the girl with cold, assessing eyes, trying to decide who she was, what family she belonged to, what purpose had brought her here, while his fingers stayed on the trigger and his heartbeat remained slow and steady, as if this were just another ordinary day in a life built on danger. And Amelia, staring at the dark gun aimed straight at her face, didn't feel fear the way she should have because she had been afraid too much tonight, afraid too much for years, afraid until fear had become part of her flesh and blood, and she didn't have the strength to be afraid anymore. If this man shot her now, at least it would be quicker than what Harlan would do to her if he found her. But then Rocco's gray eyes moved from her face to the rest of her body, and he saw everything. He saw the torn lip with blood dried into a dark line along her chin, saw the bruise spreading across her left cheek like a poisonous flower blooming on pale skin, saw the way she clutched her right ribs as if trying to keep herself from breaking apart, saw the thin hoodie smeared with grime and marked with small tears, saw the way her body wouldn't stop trembling from cold or fear or both. And something in Rocco shifted in that moment. A subtle change even he didn't fully understand as he realized this girl wasn't a threat. This girl was a victim running from something so terrifying she had crawled into a stranger's car in the middle of the night just to find somewhere to hide. He lowered the gun slowly, slid it back into the holster inside his coat, and the gray in his eyes softened a little, only a little, but enough for Amelia to understand that she wasn't going to die tonight, at least not by this man's hand. Rocco said nothing. He simply took off his expensive cashmere coat, a coat that was probably worth an entire year of her wages at the convenience store, and held it out to her, not tossing it, not throwing it, but offering it gently and with a kind of respect, as if she were a welcome guest instead of an illegal intruder in his car. Amelia stared at the coat with suspicion, survival instincts sharpened by years with Harlan screaming in her mind that nothing was free, that every kindness had a price, that she would have to pay for this coat with something she didn't want to give. But she was so cold her teeth were chattering uncontrollably, shaking so hard she couldn't command her own body. And at last she reached out, took the coat, pulled it around her shoulders, and sank into the warmth still lingering from a stranger's body like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline. And then Rocco spoke, his voice low and rough, not threatening but curious, and touched with something Amelia couldn't name. Perhaps concern, perhaps anger, but not anger at her, he asked. Only 4 simple words, yet carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. Who did this to you? Amelia didn't answer the question right away. She only stared at the stranger standing in front of her, green eyes sharp with caution and suspicion, searching for any sign of deception or some hidden motive behind his cold, not quite hostile presence. She was too used to being fooled, too used to sweet words that hid dark intentions, too used to the truth that whenever someone was kind to her, there was always a price attached, and she didn't have the strength to pay another one. But Rocco didn't press her. He simply stood there in silence and waited until she was ready. And that patience, that respect for her space that no man in her life had ever shown, made something inside Amelia begin to soften. She opened her mouth, and the first word slipped out like water seeping through a cracked dam, slow and painful. She told him about Harlan, the stepfather who had entered her life when she was young with a gentle smile and promises of a happy family. She told him about her mother, about Beatrice Reed, the woman who loved her more than anything in the world, but made the mistake of trusting a man wearing the mask of decency. She told him about the wedding, about the first months that seemed peaceful. And then about the first night Harlan raised his hand and hit her mother over nothing more than a bottle of beer. And once those first words escaped, the dam inside her broke completely, and everything poured out like a flood that couldn't be stopped. She told him about her mother's death, about the vicious cancer that stole the only woman who had ever protected her, about her mother's last apology on the hospital bed that still echoed in her ears every night. She told him about the years of hell that followed, about money stolen, freedom stripped away, dignity crushed, beatings beyond counting, broken ribs that were never treated, leaving small deformities that only an X-ray could reveal, a long scar along her scalp, hidden beneath her hair from the time Harlan threw her into the corner of a table, and she had stitched the wound herself with ordinary needle and thread because she wasn't allowed to go to the hospital. Small scattered scars across her back and thighs, the remnants of beatings with a leather belt and an electrical cord, and the psychological injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety, recurring nightmares, an exaggerated startle response to sudden triggers. All of it. Rocco listened to it all without interrupting even once. His gray eyes locked on her face as if he were memorizing every detail, every wound, every tear sliding down her cheeks that she didn't even realize she was shedding. His expression stayed as unreadable as ever. But if Amelia had looked more closely, she would have seen his jaw clenched tight, would have seen his hands curling into fists at his sides, would have seen a cold fire burning in those gray eyes, a silent anger fiercer than any screaming rage. When Amelia finished, her voice was raw, and her body shook even harder than before. Drained by the release of everything she had carried inside for years, with no one ever listening, she sat there wrapped in the warmth of his cashmere coat and waited for his reaction. Waited for the judgment or pity or indifference she had grown used to receiving from everyone around her. But Rocco did none of those things. He was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. And then he told her in a low, steady voice that she wouldn't be going back to that house tonight, that he had a guest apartment in his penthouse no one used, that she could stay there as long as she wanted until she figured out what to do, that he wanted nothing from her, demanded nothing, expected nothing, only to give her a safe place to rest and recover. Amelia looked at him as if he had just spoken a language she couldn't understand, because in her world, in her experience, no one gave anything without wanting something in return. She asked him, her voice trembling and full of doubt, why he was helping her, who she was that he should bother, what he would get out of it. Rocco held her gaze for a long time, and for the first time since they met, Amelia saw something in those cold gray eyes, something soft and aching that she couldn't name. He answered in a rough voice, saying he hated bullies who preyed on the weak, hated men who used strength and power to torment those who couldn't defend themselves. hated people who turned someone else's life into hell simply because they could. He didn't explain further, didn't tell her the deeper reason behind that hatred. But the way he said it, with fury held tightly in check and pain kept carefully hidden, made Amelia understand he wasn't only talking about Harlan. He was talking about something far more personal, some wound from his own past she didn't yet know. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Amelia decided to trust a stranger. Not because she was naive, not because she had no other choice, but because she saw in his eyes an honesty she had forgotten still existed in this world. Rocco drove the Rolls-Royce Phantom through the night streets of Manhattan in silence. And Amelia sat in the back seat, still wrapped in his cashmere coat, staring out through the window without really seeing anything, her mind hollow and hazy, as if everything that had just happened were only a strange dream she might wake from at any moment. The car stopped in front of a glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the Upper East Side, a place where the monthly rent for a single apartment was probably more than Amelia earned in an entire year at the convenience store. Rocco led her into the main lobby where a doorman in a crisp uniform bowed to him with respect edged by fear, and then they stepped into a private elevator reserved for the penthouse level. When the elevator doors opened at the top floor, Amelia felt as if she had walked into an entirely different world, a world she had never known existed outside of Hollywood movies and glossy luxury magazines. The penthouse spread out before her like a palace in the sky, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealing a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline, glittering with lights, like a sea of stars spilled onto the earth. White marble floors reflected the glow from crystal chandeliers hanging from a soaring ceiling and original works of art. Amelia was sure they were originals and not copies. Lined the elegant gray walls, polished leather and walnut furniture sat arranged with a refined taste. She didn't have the knowledge to judge, but enough instinct to understand that every piece here was worth more than the rundown apartment where she had lived for years. Rocco guided her past the main living room, down a wide hallway, and stopped at an oak door at the far end, telling her this was the guest suite, and from now on it was hers. She could stay as long as she wanted. She had full control of this space, and no one was allowed to enter without her permission. When the door opened, Amelia had to stand still for a long moment just to process what her eyes were seeing. Because this guest suite, the room Rocco spoke of as casually as if it were a small, unimportant corner of his home, was larger than the place where she had grown up with her mother in Brooklyn, more luxurious than anywhere she had ever set foot in across her years of life. There was a private sitting room with an emerald velvet sofa soft as clouds, a bedroom with a king-size bed dressed in ivory Egyptian silk sheets, a bathroom with a marble-soaking tub and a ceiling-mounted rain shower, a small kitchen fitted with the most modern appliances she didn't know how to use, and large glass doors opening to a private balcony overlooking the sleeping city below. Amelia stood in the middle of it all, still in her filthy hoodie and worn-out sneakers, feeling utterly out of place, like a house mouse that had wandered into a king's palace. Rocco watched her for a moment, and then told her there were some new clothes in the closet she could use for now, that he would have someone buy more that suited her tomorrow, that if she needed anything at all, she only had to press the button beside the bed, and someone would come immediately. Before he left, he introduced her to a tall, middle-aged man with a stern face, but eyes that weren't quite cold. A man who appeared as if from nowhere the instant Rocco spoke his name. Gino Moretti, Rocco said, was his right-hand man, and from this moment on, he would be responsible for making sure she was safe. Gino would remain right outside this suite all night, and no one would be able to come near her without going through Gino first. Amelia looked at Gino, then at Rocco, then back at the lavish room around her, and she didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel, didn't know what to do with any of it happening so fast and so unreal compared to anything she had ever known. Rocco gave her a formal nod, told her she should rest because it had been a long night, then turned and walked away, and the door closed behind him, leaving Amelia alone in a room filled with light and silence. She stood motionless for a long time, then slowly walked to the window and looked out at the city glittering beneath her. And for the first time in years, she wasn't listening for heavy footsteps outside the door, wasn't holding her breath waiting for the crash of the door being kicked open. wasn't curling in on herself to brace for the pain that always came next. Tonight, for the first time in days, Amelia Reed was allowed to feel safe. The first days in the guest suite of Rocco's penthouse were days in which Amelia was both being healed and forced to face the deepest wounds inside her. Wounds that had been buried for too long beneath a hard shell of survival, and that now, when she was finally safe, began rising to the surface like bodies floating up from the bottom of a lake. On the first night, she couldn't sleep. Even with a bed soft as clouds and a room perfectly warm, she only lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, and waiting for something terrible to happen, because she had lived too long believing that something terrible always came. On the second night, she drifted off from sheer exhaustion and fell straight into a nightmare, dreaming that Harlan had found her, was dragging her out of the suite, pinning her to the floor and raising his belt. And she screamed until her throat burned, and she woke in the darkness with her heart pounding wildly and tears streaming down her face. And the third night, the fourth, the fifth were the same. The nightmares arriving with the steady rhythm of the tide, dragging her down into the deepest waters of fear, and then spitting her back out in the morning with dark circles under her eyes and a body that wouldn't stop shaking. In the daytime, she barely left the suite. She was afraid to step outside, afraid of strangers, afraid that any sudden noise might be a sign Harlan had found her and was coming to drag her back into hell. Whenever someone knocked, even if it was only a staff member delivering food, she would jump, her heart racing. And it took her minutes to steady herself and remind her own mind that she was in a safe place, that Gino was standing guard outside, that Harlan couldn't reach her here. Rocco watched all of it from a distance. He didn't invade her space. He didn't force conversation or demand that she act normal, but he saw the bruised shadows growing deeper beneath her eyes, saw the way she flinched at loud sounds, saw her locking herself inside an invisible prison Harlan had built in her mind over years, and he knew she needed more than a safe place to sleep. She needed to be healed from the inside out. On the seventh day, Rocco introduced Amelia to a middle-aged woman with neatly cut silver hair and warm brown eyes like a cup of hot cocoa on a winter day. A woman named Dr. Elena Hayes, one of New York's leading psychologists specializing in trauma and domestic violence, someone Rocco had contacted on the very first night he brought Amelia here. At first, Amelia refused to meet her. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. She didn't want to tear open wounds that had only just begun to scab over. She didn't want a stranger looking into the darkest part of her life and judging her for being weak, for not running sooner, for enduring it too long. But Dr. Elena didn't judge. She didn't interrogate. She didn't push. She simply sat with Amelia, drinking tea in silence, telling small stories about her own life, about other patients without naming names, about the slow journey of healing for people who once believed they could never escape. And little by little, Amelia began to speak, began to tell, began to let the demons inside her be named and brought into the light. At the same time, another man appeared in Amelia's life. Harlan Vance, the Bianchi family's private attorney, an older man with silver hair, combed smoothly back and eyes sharp as razors behind gold-rimmed glasses. Harlan came to see Amelia with a thick stack of files and a detailed plan to bring Harlan Collins to justice. He explained the steps that would be required, gathering evidence, testimony, the legal process, what she would have to face if she chose to go forward. Amelia was afraid. She had tried to go to the police before and failed. She had tried to seek help and been dragged back into hell. She didn't know whether this would be different or whether another painful defeat was waiting for her. But Harlan reassured her in a calm, steady voice, telling her that this time would be different, that having Rocco Bianchi behind her meant no one would dare take a bribe and twist the case, that his team would build a file so airtight no defense attorney could crack it, that Harlan would pay for what he had done no matter how far he tried to run. Amelia listened, and for the first time in years she felt a small spark of hope begin to kindle in her chest, tiny and fragile as a candle in the wind, but still there, still burning, still casting a little light on the road ahead, even if only a short distance. Day by day, with Dr. Elena's support and Rocco's boundless patience, Amelia began to open up, began to trust, began to allow herself to heal from wounds she had once believed would never heal. Rocco Bianchi was no stranger to the pain Amelia carried inside her. He understood it more clearly than almost anyone in the world, because he had once been a young boy, standing helplessly, watching his mother endure the very same things Amelia had endured, and that memory still burned in his mind like a scar that never healed, even after years had passed. His mother, Gabriella Bianchi, was an Italian woman with long black hair like a river of night and the warmest brown eyes Rocco had ever seen. A woman born to love and be loved, yet fate placed her in the hands of Vincent Bianchi, the most ruthless and cold-blooded mafia boss New York had ever known. Vincent married Gabriella when she was young. An arranged marriage between two mafia families meant to strengthen power, and Gabriella had no right to refuse, no right to choose, no right to decide her own destiny. She tried to love Vincent, tried to be a good wife, tried to build a happy family out of bricks that had been rotting from the very beginning. But Vincent didn't know how to love. He only knew how to possess and control. And when Gabriella failed to meet his unreasonable expectations, when she dared to have her own opinion or dared to look at him with eyes that weren't frightened enough, he would teach her a lesson with his fists. Rocco still remembered the nights he lay in his room, listening to his mother's crying through the wall. The mornings he saw her wearing sunglasses to hide bruises around her eyes, even inside the house. The times he asked why she was hurt, and she only gave him a sad smile and said she'd been careless and fell, that he shouldn't worry. He had known the truth early on. He had known what kind of man his father was, but he was only a child. He had no strength, no power, no way to protect his mother from a man the entire New York underworld feared. And then that fateful night came, the night Rocco was young and studying in his room when he heard screaming and crashing from downstairs. He ran to the staircase and saw his mother lying motionless at the bottom, blood spilling from a wound on her head, the warm brown eyes now fixed and seeing nothing at all. Vincent stood there at the top of the stairs, looking down at his wife's body with eyes as cold as ice, without a flicker of emotion, without a tear, without a trace of regret. He spoke to Rocco in a tone as casual as if he were talking about the weather, saying that Rocco's mother had slipped and fallen down the stairs, that it was an unfortunate accident, and that Rocco wasn't allowed to cry because Bianchi men never cried. Rocco knew it wasn't an accident. He knew what his father had done, but he couldn't prove it, couldn't say it, couldn't do anything except stand there as they carried his mother away and swallow his tears. That night, when the whole house had fallen silent and Vincent went to bed as if nothing had happened, young Rocco knelt beside the dried blood on the marble floor and swore an oath he would carry for the rest of his life. He swore he would never become his father. He would never raise a hand to strike a woman. He would never allow anyone under his protection to endure what his mother had endured. And he kept that vow for the years, even when he inherited Vincent's empire after Vincent died of a heart attack. Even when he had to do ruthless things to maintain power in the underworld, he never laid a hand on women or children. He never allowed his men to do it. He never forgot his mother's warm brown eyes going dark at the foot of the staircase when he was young. And now, when Rocco looked at Amelia Reed, the auburn-haired girl with green eyes far too familiar with fear, he saw his mother in her. He saw Gabriella in the way Amelia flinched at every sound, in the way she lowered her head as if bracing for a blow, in the way she couldn't trust any kindness because she had been betrayed too many times. But Rocco also saw something more than that, something he didn't fully understand and didn't dare name, an attraction that reached beyond pity or sympathy. A desire to protect her not only because he hated bullies who preyed on the weak, but because he wanted to see her smile, wanted to see those green eyes brighten with happiness instead of dim with fear, wanted to be the reason she felt safe in a world that had been far too cruel to her. Weeks had passed since that fateful night, and Amelia Reed had begun to recover in ways even she hadn't expected. The bruises on her body faded day by day, and then disappeared entirely. The split lip healed until only a small scar remained, one you could see only if you looked very closely. Her ribs no longer stabbed with pain whenever she drew a deep breath, and her skin slowly regained a touch of color instead of the paper-pale whiteness of those first days. But more important than the physical changes were the changes inside her. subtle shifts that only Dr. Elena and Rocco seemed to notice. The way she no longer flinched so violently at every sound, the way she began to hold someone's gaze when she spoke. The way, now and then a small smile would flicker across her mouth when something amused her, a smile still cautious and fragile as a newly opened butterfly wing. And during those weeks a new routine formed between Amelia and Rocco, something small but bright that became the quiet highlight of both their days, though neither of them dared admit it. Every evening after Rocco finished his work and returned to the penthouse, he would invite Amelia to have dinner with him in the main dining room. Not a lavish banquet with dozens of courses like the dinners he attended for business, but a simple meal with the two of them sitting across from each other at a long oak table, eating traditional Italian dishes prepared by his private chef, talking about things that had nothing to do with the Mafia or violence or the shadows waiting beyond the door. Rocco told her about his legitimate businesses, about real estate projects and the Italian restaurant chain he was building, about the books he read when he couldn't sleep at night, about the collection of classic jazz vinyl records he had quietly gathered since he was young. Amelia listened, and her green eyes slowly brightened with curiosity and a pleasure she thought she had lost long ago. And then she began to speak as well, to share pieces of herself she had kept hidden for years. One night, when dinner was finished, and they were sitting on the balcony looking out over the city glittering with light, Amelia told Rocco about her dream. The dream of becoming a graphic designer that she had been forced to abandon when Harlan made her leave school. She told him about evenings in her dorm room with an old laptop, teaching herself Photoshop and Illustrator through videos on YouTube, about her first designs, clumsy but full of passion, about an art professor who praised her and said she had real potential if she kept going. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, a light Rocco had never seen in her before, and he realized that behind the frightened, wounded girl he had found on the floor of his car that night was a soul full of hope and longing. A flower trampled for too long, yet still strong enough to reach for the sun. Rocco listened to her for hours without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply nodded and said it was never too late to chase a dream, that if she wanted to go back to school, he would support her in every way he could, not as a favor she would have to repay, but simply because she deserved the chance to live the life she wanted. And then that night came, the night everything between them shifted in a way neither of them had seen coming. Amelia was trapped in the worst nightmare she had had since arriving here. She dreamed Harlan had found her, was dragging her out of the suite, pinning her to the floor and raising his belt. And she screamed until her throat burned, and she woke in the darkness with her heart pounding wildly and tears streaming down her face. And then she heard a knock at the door, heard Rocco calling her name in a voice thick with worry, asking if she was all right, asking if she needed him to come in. Amelia couldn't answer. She only cried the way she hadn't cried in years, and Rocco opened the door and stepped inside, saw her sitting curled up on the bed like a lost child caught in a storm, and he did what instinct told him to do. He sat down beside her, slipped an arm around her shoulders, and drew her into the wide, warm shelter of his chest, holding her without a word, letting her cry until there were no tears left, letting her shake until her body slowly calmed, letting her feel his steady heartbeat like a reminder that she was here. She was safe. She was not alone anymore. And in that moment, when Amelia lifted her face and looked into Rocco's gray eyes, when she saw his genuine worry and something far gentler beneath it, she realized something was changing between them, something beyond gratitude and protection, something she didn't dare name, yet something that had begun to kindle in her heart, like a small flame in the middle of a bitter winter night. The truth came to Amelia on an afternoon weeks after the night. Rocco held her in his arms until the nightmare finally broke, an afternoon as ordinary as any other. When she was walking down the penthouse hallway looking for a book Rocco had mentioned at dinner the night before, and she happened to pass his office door, which was slightly open. She had no intention of eavesdropping. She meant to keep walking and move on. But then Rocco's voice carried out, and it stopped her as if she'd been nailed to the floor. He was on the phone with someone, his tone cold and razor-sharp, in a way she had never heard before. Nothing like the gentle patience he gave her each evening. He spoke about territory, about shipments, about dealing with a traitor who had dared feed information to a rival family, about sending a clear message so others wouldn't dare follow. Those words, those phrases. Amelia had heard enough in movies about the underworld to understand what they meant, to understand who the man was who had saved her, given her shelter, held her while she cried in the dark. Rocco Bianchi was Mafia, a boss, a man living outside the law, and perhaps a man who had done terrible things she couldn't even bring herself to imagine. She stepped back, then another step, then turned and hurried to her suite, slamming the door behind her and sitting on the bed with her heart racing and her mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. Had she fled one hell only to fall into another? Had she trusted the wrong person again? Had she been foolish enough to be fooled by kindness on the surface while another monster waited underneath? But that evening, when Rocco knocked on her door to invite her to dinner as usual, Amelia opened it and looked straight into his eyes with an expression he had never seen from her before. An expression filled with doubt and pain and a question she didn't have to speak aloud. Rocco understood immediately. He had lived in this world too long not to recognize the moment someone discovered the truth about him. And he didn't try to lie, didn't try to justify himself, didn't try to soften what he truly was. He told her in a low, direct voice that he was the head of the Bianchi family, that his family controlled much of New York's underground activity, that he had done things the law would condemn if there were enough proof, that he was not a good man by the standards of ordinary society. But he also told her he had never lied to her about anything, that everything he had done for her had come from sincerity, that she had every right to leave right now if she wanted, and he would still make sure she was safe from Harlan wherever she went, that the choice had always been hers, and he would respect whatever decision she made. Amelia didn't say a word. She only closed the door again and left Rocco standing alone in the hallway, and she spent the next days inside her suite thinking, wrestling, weighing, placing two men on the scale of her life and measuring them against each other. Harlan Collins, an accountant, an ordinary citizen, a man society would look at and see someone respectable with a steady job and a gentle smile. Yet behind closed doors, a demon who had tormented her for years, stripped her of freedom and dignity, turned her into an empty body that knew only fear and endurance. Rocco Bianchi, a mafia boss, a man outside the law, someone society would condemn as a dangerous criminal who belonged behind bars. Yet in the past weeks, he had given her shelter without demanding anything, hired a psychologist and a lawyer to help her, listened for hours as she spoke about buried dreams, held her at night when she cried without ever touching her in a way that was wrong, given her choice when Harlan had stolen every choice away. And Amelia realized a simple but profound truth it had taken her years to understand. Titles and jobs did not define a person. Actions did, and an ordinary man could be a demon, while a mafia boss could be the only one who treated her like a human being worthy of respect. On the fourth day, Amelia opened her door and stepped out, walked down the hallway to Rocco's office, where he sat behind his desk, gray eyes full of worry as he watched her come in. She didn't say much. She only said she had decided to stay, that she didn't care who he was in the world outside this penthouse, that she only cared who he was to her. And he had shown her that for weeks through actions, not words. Rocco looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and in those cold gray eyes, Amelia saw for the first time a flicker of warmth she knew he had been hiding for a long time. The darkness Amelia thought she had left behind finally found her. On an afternoon, a month after she decided to stay with Rocco, when she was sitting in the guest suite reading a book on graphic design that Rocco had bought for her. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Gino's phone rang in the hallway, then came hurried footsteps. Then a knock at her door, fast and urgent, nothing like the usual. When she opened it, she saw that Gino's normally calm face was tighter than she had ever seen it. Gino told her a man was downstairs in the building lobby, shouting her name and demanding to see her, threatening to call the police, to sue the building, to do whatever it took to drag her back. And that man's name was Harlan Collins. Amelia's heart seemed to stop for a moment. The blood in her body felt as if it had turned to ice, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing to the floor. Harlan had found her. She didn't understand how. Even though she thought she was safe inside this fortress, he had still tracked her down like a predator, catching the scent of its prey, even at the ends of the earth. Gino explained that Harlan hadn't hired a private investigator as they first feared. Instead, Harlan had used his old contacts at the health insurance company to flag Amelia's social security number. When Rocco's team recently processed a medical evaluation for her, the system triggered an alert, allowing Harlan to track the location to this specific building. Rocco was informed at once, and he appeared beside Amelia only minutes later, his face cold as ice and his gray eyes burning with a fury she had never seen before, a silent rage more frightening than any screaming. He took her hand and asked whether she wanted to go downstairs and face Harlan, or whether she wanted to stay up here and let him handle it. And Amelia, trembling so hard she could barely breathe, said she wanted to go down. She wanted to see him. She needed to face this ghost one last time so she could truly move forward with her life. They rode the elevator down to the main lobby where chaos was unfolding. Harlan Collins stood in the middle of the marble floor, his face flushed red with anger and probably alcohol, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't changed them in days, his mouth spewing threats and obscenities, while two building security guards tried to hold him back without turning it into a brawl. The moment he saw Amelia step out of the elevator, his eyes lit with a crazed fury, and he began yelling even louder, calling her names no one deserved to be called, shouting that she was a cheating whore who had run off with some rich man, shouting that she belonged to him and he would drag her back no matter how far she ran, shouting that she would pay for daring to defy him, for daring to throw that lamp at him that night. Amelia stood still and looked at the man who had tormented her for years, and she was startled to realize the fear he used to summon in her wasn't as powerful as it once had been. He was still terrifying. He still made her heart race. But she wasn't the weak, solitary girl she had been years ago. She had Rocco beside her, Gino behind her, an entire team ready to protect her. And most of all, she had herself, an Amelia Reed who had begun to reclaim strength and self-worth after years of being crushed. Rocco signaled to his own security men, who had appeared so quietly she hadn't even noticed, and they seized Harlan in an instant, wrenching his arms behind his back and driving him down to the floor, even as he kept screaming and cursing. Rocco looked down at Harlan with an expression that could kill, and he told Amelia in a voice as cold as winter that he could take care of this man right now, that Harlan would disappear and no one would ever find the body, that this was how Rocco's world solved problems, and Harlan deserved that fate. But Amelia placed her hand on Rocco's arm and shook her head. She told him she didn't want Harlan to die that easily. She didn't want him to vanish into the night as if he had never existed. She wanted him to face what he had done in a court of law. She wanted him to stand before a judge and hear her describe every beating, every night of terror, every scar on her body and in her soul. She wanted him to look her in the eyes when the jury declared him guilty. She wanted him to rot in prison for years with the knowledge that she had won and he had lost. She told Rocco she wanted justice, not revenge, and the two were not the same thing, even if they sometimes looked similar. Rocco studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded, the respect in his gray eyes deeper than ever because he knew how much strength and courage it took for a victim to stand up and demand justice instead of letting someone else take revenge. And Amelia Reed, the girl who had once curled up on the floor of his car that night, had become a woman far stronger than she yet realized. The weeks after Harlan was taken into custody were weeks in which Amelia had to face her past in the most direct and painful way because she had to tell her story again and again to the police, to the prosecutor, to social workers, and every retelling meant reliving memories she had tried to bury for years. Harlan Vance, Rocco's attorney, worked without rest to build an airtight case against Harlan, gathering statements from neighbors who had heard screaming echo from the apartment at night, tracking down former co-workers from the convenience store, who had seen bruises on Amelia's body, and most important of all, arranging a complete medical evaluation for her at Mount Sinai Hospital, the very hospital where her mother had once worked for so many years. The results of that examination made even those who already knew Amelia's story shudder because her body carried undeniable proof of years of hell. The doctor documented ribs that had been broken and healed improperly because they were never treated, leaving small deformities that only an X-ray could reveal. There was a long scar along her scalp, hidden beneath her hair from the time Harlan threw her into the corner of a table, and she had stitched the wound herself with ordinary needle and thread because she wasn't allowed to go to the hospital. There were small, scattered scars across her back and thighs, the remnants of beatings with a leather belt and an electrical cord. And there were the psychological injuries Dr. Elena Hayes recorded in her professional report. Post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety, recurring nightmares, an exaggerated startle response to sudden triggers. All of it was compiled into a thick file that would be presented in court tomorrow. And Amelia knew she was ready to face Harlan one last time, ready to tell her story before a jury, ready to claim justice for herself and for the young girl who once had no one to protect her. On the night before the trial, Amelia stood on the penthouse balcony, looking out over Manhattan glittering below. Her emotions a strange blend of worry and calm, fear of what might happen tomorrow, and a quiet trust that no matter the outcome, she had already won simply by standing up. She didn't hear Rocco's footsteps until he was beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers, the warmth of his body spreading into the cold December air. They stood together in silence for a long time, looking out over the city. And then Rocco spoke, his voice lower and rougher than usual, as if the words he was about to say had been held in his chest for too long and were now forcing their way out. He said that before he met her, he thought he had died long ago. Died on the night his mother lay at the foot of the stairs. Died the moment he understood that power and money could buy almost anything except love and sincerity. He said he had lived like a walking corpse for years, doing what had to be done to keep his empire standing, meeting who he needed to meet, saying what he needed to say, while inside him there was a vast emptiness nothing could fill until the night he opened his car door and saw her. A young woman full of injuries and fear, yet brave enough to run, strong enough to survive, still pure enough to look at him as a human being instead of a terrifying boss or a checkbook. He told her he loved her, not the possessive, controlling love Harlan offered, but a love that made him want to see her happy, whether that happiness included him or not. A love that made him want to protect her, but also want to see her stand on her own feet. A love that made him willing to wait as long as she needed to heal and willing to accept it if she decided he wasn't the man she wanted. Amelia turned to look at